Presentation is James Herrick. He's an irrigation specialist with Cascade. James, you got the screen, I think. And you know, yesterday we talked about soil moisture monitoring a couple of times, and so we asked James if he would kind of share with us some of the things that they're doing. So.
All right, thank you. Can you guys see my screen all right?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, my name is James Herrick. Like you said, I'm an irrigation specialist. I'm located in Valley, Nebraska. My primary role is to work with both Valley irrigation dealers and growers to support our service that we call Valley Scheduling, which is kind of an advanced irrigation monitoring platform that utilizes soil moisture probes, weather data, and so on to give irrigation forecasts. But today I'm mostly going to focus on soil moisture monitoring as a whole, just kind of discussing the types of options available to growers. So jumping right into it, so why do we want to manage, or why do we want to look at soil moisture data anyways? Well, it's mostly for appropriate irrigation. Obviously, appropriate irrigation maximizes yield and profit. It reduces potential for fertilizer leaching. So if we're not over irrigating, then we're not pushing those nutrients through the rooting zone any faster than we have to. It also controls disease potential, improves crop quality, and so on. Soil moisture monitoring is a very useful tool for irrigation management, but for it to really make a whole lot of sense, for it to be useful, I guess, you really need to have some just kind of basic knowledge about the soils that you're working with. So you need to know the amount of water in the soil that is available to the crop, not just the total water in general. And we use it to manage risk of over irrigating or under irrigating. So either of those is just as bad as the other. And it also allows decisions for best placement of limited water. So in growers that live in certain areas where there's an allotment of how much water they can use per year, they can use the data that's provided by a soil moisture probe to make better decisions as to when and how much to irrigate. So jumping into the interpretation of the data a little bit. So to guide, what do the lines mean? So there's a lot of soil moisture probes out there today. They provide all sorts of data, but to guide irrigation, soil moisture data requires interpretation. So interpretation can come in a number of ways. The grower themselves can interpret the data if they know how to. The grower can work with an agronomist to interpret the data, or the grower can have some sort of service like Valley Scheduling, for example, that interprets the data for them. So to interpret it, you need to, again, have a knowledge of soil water properties. You need to know, how moisture interacts with the soil that you're working with. You need to know how much water that soil will hold. So one of the bigger parts of this is the soil texture. So for example, a sandy soil that won't hold as much water as like a clay soil, for example. And when you're working with a soil moisture probe, you really want to kind of dial in what your root zone depth is. So for example, if you have a 36-inch probe and you're trying to manage irrigation for a corn crop at the early part of the growing season, you don't really want to take into account that entire 36 inches right off the bat, because we don't have roots down that far and that water isn't available. If there is water down there, it's not available to the crop quite yet. And you also need to understand the type of soil moisture data that you're being provided with. So the two major types of probes are ones that read soil moisture tension. That can be read out in centibars or kilopascals, or soil water content. Soil water content, at least in my kind of territory, seems to be the one of the more popular ones. Tensiometers are still very popular, but soil water content is what I work with the most. And soil water content kind of comes down to total water within the soil. So that can be inches of total water, or percent of volume, or even percent of weight, or percent of field capacity. So we're really trying to convert the data into actionable information for the end user to actually have some benefit. So this graphic here that I'm pulling up, I think that does a really good job of helping explain some of the terminology that we use when it comes to different soil water holding capacities. So at the very top of the graphic on the right, we have what's called saturation. So saturation kind of defined as like if you have a low spot in your field, there's no pore space left in the soil there, so the water just kind of stands there. It doesn't have anywhere to infiltrate. Below saturation, we have what's called field capacity. So field capacity is defined as water content after gravity drainage. So that's the water that's left in the soil after drainage by gravity is stopped. So I like to kind of explain soil as like a sponge. So if you take a sponge and run it underneath your kitchen sink for a while, there comes a point where that sponge can't take in any more water, and you set it down on your kitchen counter and you lightly touch it and a little bit of moisture comes out of it. That would be like field capacity in a soil. So field capacity, that water is readily available to the crop. It doesn't have to work very hard to extract it from the soil. On the flip side, underneath field capacity, we have what's called permanent wilting point. And permanent wilting point is defined as the water that's held too tightly for plant removal. So again, going back to that sponge example, if you take that same sponge and you wring it out as much as you can, try to get all the moisture out of it, you feel it and it still feels a bit moist. Well, that's kind of like permanent wilting point in the soils. There's still water in the soils, but it's bound too tightly within the soil itself for the plant to extract it. So that plant isn't able to extract every drop of water from that soil just because of how tightly bound it is. Now, between field capacity and permanent wilting point, we call that water plant available water. So that's the water that the plant is physically able to extract from the soil. But below field capacity, we have what's called the MAD, or management allowed depletion line. And that's the management allowed depletion line is defined as the water available to plants before stress. So between field capacity and management allowed depletion, the assumption there is that that water is pretty readily accessible to the plant. That's called like the readily available water. So between those two lines, the plant doesn't have to work very hard to extract that water from the soil. Another assumption is once the average soil moisture falls below that management allowed depletion line, then it becomes harder and harder for that plant to extract the water. So that's when you really need to be irrigating so that you can maintain a soil moisture between field capacity and management allowed depletion. So looking at the different monitoring options available to you. So the most common one is the hand feel method. That's like what a lot of us were taught in FFA, for example. You take a ball of soil, you ribbon it, and you try to see what the soil's like. Hand feel method, definitely the most common. They can give you a lot of good information about the soil. I do that every time I install a soil moisture probe. When I use the hand feel method, I'm mostly looking for texture. So I can relate the texture back to the water holding capacity. And I also ribbon the soil to see approximately how much water is in the soil to begin with, so I can calibrate, get a good calibration right off the bat. Not a whole lot of tools required for this, mostly just a shovel or even a soil sampler. And you definitely need some experience to do this as well. I would say that this one's probably the most open to interpretation. It seems like everybody has kind of their own definition of what's dry and what's moist. Another type of main type of soil moisture probe are soil moisture tension probes. So these measure how strongly water is held in the soil. These are kind of the original soil moisture monitoring. They've been around for decades. They're relatively inexpensive, and we're mostly looking at water availability with these types of sensors. Most of these are kind of defined as tensiometers, and examples of these are watermark sensors or aerometers. Soil water content sensors, again, these are the ones that I mostly work with. These ones measure total water in the soil. Neutron probe would be an example of this. I don't really have a whole lot of neutron probes in my territory. I think they're more common in the Pacific Northwest, for example. These ones offer periodic, accurate measurement of total water in the soil. And when I say total water, I don't mean plant available water. I mean total water all the way from saturation down to oven dry. Capacitance and Tdr sensors, these can offer continuous measure of total water in the soil. So For example, with these, you can hook them up to a telemetry device that can constantly transmit that data to another platform for it to be interpreted and so on. Examples of capacitance probes would be like a Centec drill and drops. TDRs would be like an Acclima. So hopping into soil moisture tension sensors. So these ones provide tension data. And off to the right here in this graph, this is just an example of what some of that data looks like. So in this light blue line here, so this is a period of time where the tension is high. And when you see high tension, that means that the soil is pretty dry. The crop has to work harder to extract that moisture from the soil. And on that same line, when it gets a little bit, when the tension is lower, that's when you have a pretty moist soil. That moisture is just more freely available to the crop. Soils vary in tension characteristics, so that's something to be aware of. You really need to know your soil moisture tension ranges. For example, clay soils will hold water at a greater tension than sandy soils. So looking at soil moisture content sensors, so these measure the amount of total water in the soil. And again, you need to know your soil water holding capacity to interpret this data. Yeah, neutron probes are an example of these, and capacitance and Tdr sensors. With capacitance and Tdr sensors, they can be just individual sensors that are hooked into to one telemetry device. For example, like Acclimas, you can have a series of those hooked into one device, all buried at multiple depths. Or for example, like the Centec drill and drop probe that we primarily work with, that has, depending on the length of the probe itself, that can have multiple sensors on it. So for example, the Centec drill and drop 36-inch probe, you're going to have about 9 individual sensors on that, spaced 4 inches apart. So it just kind of depends on your current situation, whichever one works best for you. With soil moisture content sensors, these are typically calibrated to inches of water per foot or percent by volume. So just to give a quick example of percent by volume, so 10%, if your probe was reading 10% by volume and you were monitoring 12 inches of soil, that would mean that you would have approximately 1.2 inches of total water in that soil. So here's an example of capacitance probe readings. This one was pulled directly from Valley Scheduling. So this one is also a Centec drill and drop 24-inch probe. So this one has 6 individual sensors on it. Each line here is its own individual sensor. So we started monitoring this field around the early part of June, all through the later part of September. So this is what it really comes down to, is interpreting the data, looking at this data, and kind of figuring out what's going on in the field. So right off the bat here, you can see kind of the stair-step trend that's going on in some of these lines here. So that's a classic example of crop water use during the day. You know, it takes a bit, the roots will take a big drink during the day, then kind of level off. Then the next day they take a really big drink, then level off. So that's kind of the daily trend that goes on there. And what's interesting about this data is that some of these lines kind of start to plateau a little bit after a few weeks. The stair-step action kind of goes away and they just sort of flatten out. So that's usually a pretty good indicator that you've probably extracted all of the moisture from that layer that you could. The roots are probably looking at other layers to extract more water. Towards the middle part of the season here, we had a really good rainfall in this field. So you can see a lot of these lines really spiked up in terms of their moisture. So we had a really nice deep penetration there for the rainfall that we received. Towards the later part of the season, we noticed a really poor moisture penetration. So every few days there, the grower was making a pass on his pivot. This blue line here is actually the very top sensor. So this one's buried about, I don't know, probably about 2 to 4 inches underneath the soil. And the red sensor is a sensor directly below it and about another 4 inches. So you can see whenever the grower made a pass on his pivot, it never really got any deeper than that 2 inches down. The layers below that really didn't show any sort of response to moisture. So this could be an example of poor moisture penetration from the soil. So maybe a soil that doesn't have very good infiltration rates, or it could be that, that the soil was already pretty moist to begin with when that grower made a pass, and there wasn't any pore space left in that soil for the water to infiltrate. So he could have had some runoff there. But you can definitely see here that even though he was irrigating, the lower layers were definitely getting quite a bit drier, and the top and the irrigation that he was putting on wasn't replenishing the moisture. So ultimately, with the soil moisture probe data, we're looking for actionable information. You can use the data to look for trends, like I just showed you in the previous slide. So, for example, with that grower, if he didn't have a soil moisture probe out in his field, it would have been kind of hard to tell that that he was having some penetration issues with his irrigation passes. So we look for weekly or semi-weekly monitoring to give feedback on irrigation adequacy. We try to maintain adequate soil moisture between that full and refill point. So again, we're trying to maintain between field capacity and management allowed depletion so that we don't stress the crop. Real-time soil moisture monitoring can give you a few different pieces of information there. We can get daily percent field capacity, which is what Valley scheduling provides, for example. So we try to maintain above the management allowed depletion. And that's typically set at about 60 to 80% of field capacity, or 20 to 40% of your plant available water. So it really depends though on the type of crop that you're working with, the growth stage, and so on. We're also looking at the daily soil moisture deficit. So that's the amount of moisture needed to reach field capacity. So how much water would you need to apply in order to bring you back up to 100%? So you can measure that directly, or convert from percent of field capacity, or convert soil moisture tension to percent of field capacity and deficit after doing a little bit of math. And we're monitoring effectiveness every step of the way. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about Valley scheduling, which is again the service that we provide. So we utilize compatible capacitance probes, mostly Semtech drill and drops, a little bit of aqua checks, and we work with TDRs a little bit as well, but we're not able to use tensiometers, watermarks, anything like that, unfortunately. So the data is collected automatically from the probe by what's called an AgSense AquaTrack. So that probe is tied into the AquaTrack, and it's collecting data and sending it to the AgSense platform about every 2 hours. Once that data is collected, it's then pushed off to the Valley scheduling platform where it's all interpreted. So the Valley scheduling platform interprets the data for you. There's no need for any complex calculations. So for growers, for example, who have their own spreadsheet to do like the checkbook method for irrigation management, they don't really need to do that if they have a program like Valley scheduling. So we use weather, soil, crop, and soil moisture data to formulate a 5 to 7 day irrigation forecast. And we also give soil moisture readings in percent of field capacity or in terms of available water. So here's an example of the Valley scheduling platform. So this is on the desktop version. So right off the bat, everything is color coded on the Valley scheduling platform. If you see the blue colors here, that means that you're at 100% of field capacity or above on average. Green means that you're in the good range of soil moisture. So you're maintaining between field capacity and your management allowed depletion line. Yellow or orange means that you're approaching your management allowed depletion line. So you should think about irrigating. And then if you ever see red displayed, then that means that you're at your management allowed depletion line or below. So that's the point where you would want to kick on your irrigation machine to put on a pass or just to minimize stress. In the top right here, we have the irrigation forecast window. So what this is telling you is if you don't irrigate today, tomorrow, the next day, or the next day, what's that going to do to your soil moisture? So for example, with the Sycon 5 field, if the grower waited until the 7th of September to irrigate, he would have a deficit of about 0.73 inches. So that's what he would apply to bring him back up to 100% of field capacity. But he's still in the green at that point, and he's projected to be at 85% of field capacity. So he really doesn't need to irrigate at that point he should really be looking at when he starts dipping down into the yellow, into the red. So if you click on one of these fields here, like on the interactive map, you're also provided with a 7-day irrigation forecast. So you get a few extra days worth of perspective. Each day is going to tell you some more information. So the current deficit that you need to make up, what it's projected to be at for percent of field capacity. And aside from those two things, we also provide you with about the amount of time that it would take for your system to make a pass. So in this case, if this grower wanted to make a 6,500 of an inch pass, he would set his panel to about 19%, and it would take about 42 hours to make a pass. We also provide degree days for the day. We also give them accumulated values as well. And we also provide crop water use for each day. So wrapping it all up here, soil moisture monitoring is a very useful tool. At the end of the day, though, you really need to know how to interpret the data to make it work for you. Interpretation differs depending on the type of sensor that you're using. So again, whether you have a sensor that reads total soil water content or soil moisture tension, interpretation of those two is going to be different. You really need to know your soil's water holding capacity to help formulate an irrigation schedule. And it helps to have a good data platform like Valley Scheduling, for example, that provides you with actionable information so that you don't have to interpret all the data yourself. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. This is my contact information on the screen here. I've also provided a demo login for the Valley Scheduling site that we have set up online. So if you just go to this URL and put in this username and password, then you'd be able to kind of play around with the platform yourself. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, James. We see a number of companies providing these type of services, and so I appreciate you showing that. Before we go on to the next one quick question is, why do you want to irrigate back to field capacity if you've got water stored below in the root zone? Is that just to match up with what the pivots applying, or are you actually monitoring the root zone?
Some growers, not really up in, I guess, your guys' neck of the woods, but especially down south, they want to manage as close to 100% of field capacity as possible, just because they have limited water as it is. And if they fall behind, then sometimes it's really hard for them to catch up. So on the irrigation forecast window that I showed you, that's really just the forecast. It's not really a recommendation on how much water you should apply. It's just the amount of water that it would take to bring you back up into full. So that's where the color scale kind of comes into play here. So you can use that to help gauge when you're going to be dipping down to that stress line.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.